I never imagined that the person I welcomed into my family with open arms would one day try to kill me with my own heart medication. At 72 years old, I thought I'd seen enough of life to recognize danger when it came knocking. But evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives with a warm smile, homemade cookies, and promises to take care of everything, while slowly poisoning you from the inside out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Olivia Henderson, and for the past 50 years, I've called the quiet streets of Riverside, Oregon my home. It's the kind of place where neighbors still wave from their front porches, where the mailman knows everyone by name, and where secrets are harder to keep than dandelions out of your garden. I moved here with my late husband Robert when Daniel was just 5 years old, drawn by the promise of good schools and safer streets than the bustling city we'd left behind. Robert passed away 8 years ago after a sudden heart attack, leaving me alone in our modest two-story house on Elm Street. The blue Victorian with white trim had been our pride and joy, filled with decades of family photos, holiday celebrations, and the gentle wear that comes from a life well lived. After Robert's funeral, I thought I'd manage just fine on my own. I'd always been independent, working as a librarian for 30 years before retirement, and I had my routines, my garden, and my Wednesday book club to keep me company. What I hadn't anticipated was how my own heart would begin to fail me 3 years later. The diagnosis came during what I thought was a routine checkup with Dr. Peterson at Pine Valley Medical Center. Congestive heart failure, he explained with the gentle bedside manner that had made him Riverside's most trusted physician for over 2 decades. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but serious enough to require daily medication and regular monitoring. The pills became as much a part of my morning routine as my first cup of coffee. Small white tablets that looked innocent enough but carried the power to keep my heart beating steadily through each day. Dr. Peterson had been very specific about the importance of taking them exactly as prescribed, warning me that missing doses or taking them incorrectly could have serious consequences. I kept them in a weekly pill organizer on my kitchen counter, right next to the sugar bowl where one couldn't possibly forget them. For 2 years, I managed my condition well. I attended my monthly appointments religiously, took my medication without fail, and maintained the active lifestyle that Dr. Peterson encouraged. I still tended my rose garden behind the house, still walked the 6 blocks to the Rosewood Community Center for my book club meetings, and still felt capable of living independently, despite my son Daniel's increasing suggestions that I might need help. Daniel had always been a good son, though perhaps a bit too focused on practical matters for my taste. After graduating with a business degree, he'd moved to Portland for work but visited every few weeks, usually bringing concerns about my living situation, my driving, or my general well-being. I appreciated his attention, even when it felt suffocating, because I knew it came from love. He'd inherited his father's serious nature and his grandmother's tendency to worry about everything that could possibly go wrong. When Daniel announced his engagement to Rachel 3 years ago, I was genuinely thrilled. At 38, he'd dated several women over the years but never seemed ready to settle down until he met Rachel Morrison at a professional conference in Seattle. She was everything I thought my son needed: organized, ambitious, and apparently devoted to him. A pharmaceutical sales representative with a warm laugh and an easy way of making conversation, Rachel seemed to light up Daniel's sometimes too serious world. The wedding was beautiful, held at a vineyard outside Portland with stunning views of Mount Hood in the distance. Rachel looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, and Daniel couldn't stop smiling throughout the entire ceremony. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. As I watched them exchange vows, I felt a deep satisfaction that my son had found someone who would love and care for him the way Robert had loved and cared for me. During their courtship and engagement, Rachel made every effort to include me in their lives. She'd call regularly just to chat, asking about my health, my garden, and my activities at the community center. When they visited, she'd bring small gifts, specialty teas she thought I might enjoy, books from authors she'd heard me mention, or flowers from farmers markets in Portland. She showed genuine interest in family photos and stories about Daniel's childhood, laughing at all the right moments, and asking thoughtful questions about our family history. After their honeymoon in Italy, Daniel and Rachel settled into a sleek downtown Portland apartment that perfectly reflected their dual professional incomes and shared taste for modern minimalism. Rachel's pharmaceutical career was flourishing, with frequent business trips and an impressive salary that complemented Daniel's work as a financial advisor. They seemed to have everything young couples dream of: successful careers, financial stability, and a bright future stretching ahead of them. For the first year of their marriage, our relationship continued to grow stronger. Rachel would often drive down to Riverside on Saturdays, sometimes with Daniel but frequently alone, spending the afternoon helping me with household projects, or simply sitting on the back porch sharing stories over iced tea. She had a way of listening that made me feel heard and valued, something I'd missed more than I realized since Robert's death. It was Rachel who first suggested that I might benefit from having family closer by when my heart condition was diagnosed. She'd researched congestive heart failure extensively, she told me, and understood the importance of having support nearby in case of emergencies. Her concern felt genuine and touching, especially when she began calling more frequently to check on how I was feeling and whether I was remembering to take my medication consistently. The first hint of change came during one of Rachel's solo visits about 6 months after my diagnosis. She'd arrived earlier than usual, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her, and I'd found her in the kitchen making coffee when I came downstairs from my morning shower. Nothing unusual about that, except she seemed startled when I appeared, quickly closing the cabinet where I kept my medication with what looked like nervous energy. When I mentioned how nice it was to have coffee ready, she laughed and said she'd wanted to surprise me with breakfast in bed, but had gotten distracted exploring my spice collection. The explanation made perfect sense, and I dismissed the momentary odd feeling I'd had about finding her near my pills. After all, as a pharmaceutical sales representative, Rachel was naturally curious about medications, and I'd probably mentioned my heart pills in conversation dozens of times. Over the following months, Rachel's visits became more frequent and her helpfulness more pronounced. She'd arrive with groceries I hadn't asked for, insisting that I needed to maintain better nutrition for my heart health. She'd reorganize my medication area, claiming she wanted to make sure everything was properly labeled and easily accessible. She even scheduled and attended a doctor's appointment with me, taking detailed notes and asking Dr. Peterson questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Dr. Peterson seemed charmed by Rachel's attentiveness, commenting afterward how fortunate I was to have such a caring daughter-in-law who took my health so seriously. I agreed wholeheartedly, feeling grateful that Daniel had married someone who genuinely cared about my well-being. When Rachel suggested that she could help manage my medication schedule to ensure I never missed a dose, I was touched by her dedication and readily agreed. The system Rachel implemented seemed foolproof. She'd arrive every Sunday afternoon with a fresh weekly pill organizer, carefully counting out my heart medication and arranging it in the daily compartments. She'd also bring my monthly prescription pickup from the pharmacy, having added herself as an authorized representative on my account to make the process more convenient. The arrangement meant I had one less errand to worry about, and Rachel seemed to take pride in ensuring everything was perfectly organized. For several months, this routine worked seamlessly. My heart condition remained stable, my energy levels were good, and I felt more connected to family than I had since Robert's death. Rachel's frequent visits meant regular social interaction, and her genuine interest in my daily life made me feel less isolated. Daniel seemed pleased that his wife and mother had developed such a close relationship, often commenting on how much it meant to him that the two most important women in his life got along so well. The first sign that something might be wrong came during a routine appointment with Dr. Peterson in early spring. He seemed puzzled by my latest test results, frowning at the numbers on his computer screen in a way that made my stomach clench with worry. My heart function hadn't improved as expected, and some markers suggested my condition might actually be worsening, despite consistent medication compliance. Dr. Peterson asked detailed questions about my symptoms, my energy levels, and my medication routine. I assured him that I'd been taking my pills exactly as prescribed, never missing a dose thanks to Rachel's careful organization system. He nodded thoughtfully but ordered additional tests and suggested we increase my medication dosage to see if that would help stabilize my condition. The increased dosage meant larger pills and a more complex schedule, but Rachel adapted her Sunday routine without complaint. If anything, she seemed more attentive than ever, often calling during the week to ask how I was feeling and whether I was experiencing any side effects from the medication adjustment. Her concern felt genuine and appropriate, especially when she suggested keeping a symptom diary to track my daily energy levels and any unusual sensations. What I didn't realize was that my condition was actually getting worse, because the pills Rachel was giving me weren't medication at all. They were sugar pills, harmless but completely useless for treating my heart condition. While I faithfully took what I believed was my prescribed medication, my heart was slowly deteriorating from lack of proper treatment. The symptoms I was experiencing, the fatigue and occasional chest tightness, weren't side effects of medication but rather signs of my untreated condition progressively worsening. Rachel's plan was diabolically simple and nearly impossible to detect. As a pharmaceutical sales representative, she had access to various medications and understood exactly how heart medications worked and what would happen if they were discontinued. She also knew enough about the healthcare system to manipulate my prescription process without raising immediate suspicions. By gradually replacing my real medication with sugar pills that looked identical, she could slowly allow my heart condition to deteriorate while appearing to be the devoted daughter-in-law who was helping manage my care. The inheritance motive wasn't immediately obvious, because I'd never discussed my will in detail with Daniel or Rachel. However, after Robert's death, I'd updated my will to leave everything to Daniel as my only child, including the house, my savings, and a life insurance policy that had grown considerably over the decades. The total value wasn't enormous by some standards, but it represented a substantial sum that could eliminate Daniel and Rachel's mortgage and provide them with financial security for years to come. What made Rachel's plan particularly insidious was how she positioned herself as my primary caregiver and advocate. By inserting herself into my medical care, she gained access to my prescriptions and medical information while appearing to be the loving family member who was ensuring I received the best possible care. Her frequent visits weren't just opportunities to replace my medication, but also chances to monitor my declining condition and adjust her timeline accordingly. The psychological manipulation was perhaps even more harmful than the physical danger. Rachel worked systematically to isolate me from other sources of support, subtly discouraging my friendships and activities while positioning herself as my primary connection to the outside world. She'd suggest that my book club friends were too demanding, that walking to the Comoral Community Center was too risky given my heart condition, and that I should rely more on family rather than troubling neighbors with my needs. Gradually, without realizing what was happening, I began to withdraw from the social connections that had sustained me since Robert's death. My Wednesday book club attendance became sporadic, then stopped altogether when Rachel suggested that the evening meetings were too tiring for someone with my condition. My casual friendships with neighbors cooled as I became more dependent on Rachel for errands and social interaction. Even my relationship with Dr. Peterson became filtered through Rachel's interpretation of my symptoms and needs. The most chilling aspect of Rachel's deception was how she used my genuine affection for her as a weapon against me. Every expression of concern, every helpful gesture, every moment of apparent intimacy was calculated to make me more dependent on her, while simultaneously making it harder for me to question her motives or actions. She was slowly killing me with kindness, literally, while ensuring that I would trust her completely until the very end. As summer progressed and my condition continued to deteriorate, despite what I believed was proper medication, Rachel began making subtle suggestions about my future care needs. She'd mention how difficult it must be for me to maintain such a large house, how scary it could be to live alone with a serious heart condition, and how much she and Daniel worried about my safety and well-being. These conversations always ended with reassurances that I shouldn't worry because family would always take care of me, but the underlying message was clear. My independence was becoming a liability that needed to be managed. The suggestions became more specific over time. Rachel would point out maintenance issues with the house that seemed beyond my ability to address, safety concerns that could become dangerous for someone with my health problems, and financial considerations about the cost of maintaining a large property on a fixed income. She never directly suggested that I should move or make any major changes, but she consistently planted seeds of doubt about whether my current living situation was sustainable or safe. During one particularly difficult week when I'd been experiencing more fatigue and chest discomfort than usual, Rachel broached the subject of advance directives and healthcare proxies. She'd done research, she explained, and thought it would be wise for me to have legal documents in place that would ensure my wishes were respected if my condition worsened. She'd even consulted with an attorney friend who could help me prepare the necessary paperwork at no charge. The documents Rachel helped me prepare were comprehensive and appeared to be in my best interests, but they also gave Daniel and Rachel significant authority over my healthcare decisions if I became incapacitated. At the time, this seemed like responsible planning, especially since Rachel had demonstrated such dedication to my care and well-being. I signed the papers with gratitude, touched that my daughter-in-law was thinking so carefully about my future needs. What I didn't understand was that these documents were another crucial piece of Rachel's plan. If her medication manipulation succeeded in causing a serious cardiac event, she would have legal authority to make decisions about my treatment and care. She could potentially limit aggressive interventions, choose hospice care over curative treatment, or make other decisions that would ensure her plan reached its intended conclusion. By late summer, my declining condition had become noticeable to others beyond my immediate family. Margaret Collins, my next-door neighbor of 15 years, commented on how tired I looked during one of our brief conversations over the fence between our yards. She'd noticed that I wasn't spending as much time in my garden and wondered if everything was all right with my health. Her genuine concern was touching, but I assured her that I was managing fine with medication and regular doctor visits. Margaret's observation was the first crack in the wall of isolation Rachel had built around me. Unlike my book club friends or other casual acquaintances, Margaret saw me regularly and had known me long enough to recognize significant changes in my appearance and behavior. Her comment made me pause to consider whether my condition was really as well managed as I'd believed, and whether the increasing fatigue and weakness I was experiencing might be more serious than normal medication side effects. That evening, I found myself studying my reflection in the bathroom mirror with new eyes. My face did look thinner than it had months earlier, and there were dark circles under my eyes that hadn't been there before. My complexion had a grayish tinge that I'd attributed to the changing seasons and reduced outdoor time, but now I wondered if it might be something more concerning. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of real fear about my condition, and whether it was progressing faster than expected. The fear intensified over the following days as I became more aware of physical symptoms I'd been dismissing or attributing to normal aging. My appetite had decreased significantly, leaving me feeling weak and lightheaded at times. My sleep was frequently interrupted by an uncomfortable sensation in my chest that made it hard to find a comfortable position. Most alarming, I'd experienced several episodes of what felt like heart palpitations, irregular beats that left me feeling shaky and uncertain. When I mentioned these symptoms to Rachel during her next visit, she expressed appropriate concern, but suggested they might be side effects of my increased medication dosage. She'd researched my heart medication extensively, she said, and these symptoms weren't uncommon during dosage adjustments. She recommended keeping a more detailed symptom log and mentioned that she'd be happy to attend my next doctor's appointment to help me describe what I'd been experiencing. Rachel's explanation was medically plausible and delivered with convincing expertise, but something about her response felt slightly off in a way I couldn't quite identify. There was a quality to her concern that seemed practiced rather than spontaneous, and her quick attribution of my symptoms to medication side effects felt almost too convenient. For the first time since she'd begun helping with my care, I found myself questioning whether she might be wrong about something important. That night, I lay awake thinking about the conversation and trying to understand why Rachel's response had left me feeling uneasy. She'd said all the right things, offered appropriate reassurance, and demonstrated the same attentiveness she'd shown for months. Yet something fundamental felt different, as if I was seeing our interaction through a slightly altered lens that revealed details I'd missed before. The shift in my perception was subtle, but significant. Instead of feeling grateful for Rachel's medical knowledge and concern, I found myself wondering how she could be so confident about medication side effects when I was the one experiencing them. Instead of appreciating her offer to attend my doctor's appointment, I questioned why she seemed so eager to be present for my medical discussions. Most unsettling, I began to wonder whether her quick explanations for my symptoms might be preventing me from seeking more immediate medical attention. These doubts felt disloyal and ungrateful, especially given everything Rachel had done to help me manage my condition. I tried to dismiss them as paranoid thoughts brought on by illness and isolation, but they persisted despite my attempts to focus on Rachel's positive contributions to my care. Something deep in my instincts was warning me that the person I trusted most with my health and well-being might not have my best interests at heart. The warning signs I'd been unconsciously noticing for weeks suddenly seemed more significant when viewed through this new lens of suspicion. Rachel's startled reaction when I'd found her near my medication cabinet months earlier took on a different meaning. Her insistence on managing my prescription pickups and pill organization, which had seemed helpful, now felt controlling. Her frequent calls to check on my symptoms, rather than caring, seemed like monitoring for some purpose I didn't yet understand. Most disturbing was the realization that my condition had been steadily worsening, despite what I believed was proper medication compliance. Dr. Peterson had seemed genuinely puzzled by my lack of improvement, and the increased dosage hadn't produced the expected results. If I was really taking my heart medication as prescribed, shouldn't my condition be stable or improving rather than deteriorating? The possibility that something was wrong with my medication was almost too frightening to consider seriously. It implied either a serious error by the pharmacy or something far more sinister. But as I lay in the darkness of my bedroom, listening to my irregular heartbeat and feeling the weakness that had become my constant companion, I couldn't shake the growing conviction that I needed to investigate what was really happening to me. The following morning brought an unexpected visit from Rachel, earlier than her usual Sunday schedule. I was still in my bathrobe, sipping coffee, and trying to shake off the lingering unease from my sleepless night, when I heard her key in the front door. She called out a cheerful greeting as she entered, but there was something forced about her enthusiasm that matched my growing sense that our relationship had somehow shifted overnight. Rachel appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying a small pharmacy bag and wearing the bright smile she typically reserved for our most pleasant visits. She explained that she'd picked up my medication refill a day early because she'd been in the area for a work appointment and wanted to save herself the trip tomorrow. The explanation was perfectly reasonable, yet I found myself studying her face for signs of deception in a way that would have seemed absurd just days earlier. As Rachel began her usual routine of organizing my weekly pills, I watched her movements with new attention to detail. Her hands were steady and confident as she opened the prescription bottle and counted out the small white tablets, but I noticed she positioned herself so that her body blocked my direct view of the process. When I moved slightly to get a better look, she shifted naturally to maintain the visual barrier, all while maintaining casual conversation about the weather and her work schedule. The pills she placed in my weekly organizer looked identical to the ones I'd been taking for months, but something about the way she handled them seemed different. She was more careful about ensuring that no tablets fell to the counter, more deliberate about closing the prescription bottle immediately after counting out the week's supply. Most notably, she seemed reluctant to let me examine the pills closely, quickly snapping the organizer shut and moving it to its usual spot before I could get a good look. When I casually mentioned that I'd been having trouble sleeping due to some chest discomfort, Rachel's response was immediate and comprehensive. She launched into a detailed explanation of how heart medications could affect sleep patterns, particularly during dosage adjustments, and suggested several remedies that might help. Her knowledge was impressive and her concern seemed genuine, but there was an underlying urgency to her response that felt disproportionate to my casual comment. More concerning was how quickly Rachel steered our conversation away from my symptoms and toward other topics. When I tried to describe the irregular heartbeats I'd been experiencing, she interrupted with reassurances about medication side effects before I could finish explaining what I was feeling. When I mentioned Margaret's observation about my appearance, Rachel dismissed it with a laugh, suggesting that neighbors always worry unnecessarily about things they don't understand. The pattern of deflection and dismissal continued throughout her visit. Every concern I raised about my condition was met with a medical explanation that seemed designed to discourage further discussion, rather than genuinely address my worries. Rachel's expertise in pharmaceutical matters, which had previously felt reassuring, now seemed like a tool being used to silence my questions rather than answer them. During her visit, Rachel suggested several changes to my daily routine that she claimed would support my heart health. She recommended that I limit my physical activity to gentle indoor movements, avoid the stress of social obligations like book club meetings, and reduce stimulating activities like reading or watching television in the evening. These suggestions were presented as caring advice from someone knowledgeable about cardiac care, but they would effectively isolate me further from outside influences and sources of support. Rachel also began making subtle comments about my mental clarity and memory, suggesting that heart conditions could sometimes affect cognitive function in older adults. She mentioned articles she'd read about the importance of having trusted family members involved in healthcare decisions, when patients might not be thinking clearly due to illness or medication effects. The implications were clear. I was becoming less capable of managing my own affairs and needed to rely more heavily on her judgment and assistance. The conversation took an even more troubling turn when Rachel began discussing my living situation with renewed intensity. She painted a picture of increasing vulnerability, describing scenarios where my heart condition could create dangerous situations if I continued living alone. What if I had a cardiac event while gardening and no one found me for hours? What if I forgot to take my medication or took too much by mistake? What if I fell and couldn't reach the phone to call for help? Each hypothetical crisis Rachel described felt more real and terrifying than the last, creating a sense of impending doom that made my current independence seem reckless rather than admirable. She spoke with the authority of someone who understood cardiac care and the practical realities of aging, making her warnings feel like professional medical advice rather than manipulation. The cumulative effect was to make me question whether I was being foolishly stubborn about maintaining my independence. Rachel's proposed solutions to these manufactured crises all involved increasing my dependence on her and Daniel. She suggested that I might be safer in an assisted living facility where medical help would be immediately available. Alternatively, she proposed that I could move into the guest room of their Portland apartment, where they could monitor my condition closely and ensure I received proper care. Both options would, of course, require selling my house and liquidating my assets to pay for the transition. The financial implications of Rachel's suggestions were presented as practical considerations rather than primary motivations. She spoke knowledgeably about the costs of maintaining a large house on a fixed income, the potential for major repairs that could become financially overwhelming, and the wisdom of converting real estate assets into more liquid forms that could be easily managed if my condition worsened. Her arguments were logical and well-researched, making it difficult to argue against them without appearing unreasonable. What made Rachel's pressure particularly effective was how she wove genuine medical concerns with manufactured crises to create a compelling narrative of necessity. My heart condition was real, and some of the risks she described were legitimate possibilities for someone with my diagnosis. However, she was dramatically overstating the immediate danger while understating my actual capabilities and the effectiveness of less drastic solutions. Rachel's manipulation extended beyond our direct conversations to influence my interactions with others. She began accompanying me to more activities and appointments, positioning herself as my advocate and interpreter, while subtly discouraging me from speaking independently. During a routine grocery store trip, she intervened when I tried to carry a bag that she claimed was too heavy for someone with my condition. At the pharmacy, she spoke for me when the pharmacist asked routine questions about my medication. These interventions appeared caring and protective to outside observers, but they systematically undermined my autonomy and reinforced the narrative that I was becoming incapable of managing basic tasks. Other people began treating me with the careful concern reserved for fragile elderly individuals, responding to Rachel's cues about my limitations rather than interacting with me directly. The social reinforcement of my supposed helplessness became a self-fulfilling prophecy that made me question my own capabilities. Rachel's control over my medication regimen became more elaborate and restrictive during this period. She instituted a new system where she would call me each morning to remind me to take my pills, ostensibly to ensure I didn't forget, but actually to monitor my compliance with her poisonous substitutions. She also began asking detailed questions about how I felt after taking each dose, claiming she was tracking my response to help optimize my treatment. The daily phone calls served multiple purposes beyond medication monitoring. They allowed Rachel to assess my physical and mental state, gauge whether her plan was progressing as expected, and adjust her timeline accordingly. They also provided opportunities to reinforce her medical authority and my dependence on her guidance. Most insidiously, they created a routine that made Rachel's constant presence in my life feel normal and necessary rather than intrusive. During these conversations, Rachel would often mention research studies or medical articles she'd read about heart conditions, sharing information that supported her narrative about my declining capabilities and increasing vulnerability. She spoke with the confidence of someone with professional medical knowledge, citing statistics about cardiac events in elderly patients and success rates for various treatment approaches. The information was typically accurate but selectively presented to support her agenda rather than provide balanced education. Rachel's professional background in pharmaceutical sales gave her manipulation additional credibility that would have been impossible for someone without medical expertise to achieve. When she spoke about medication interactions, side effects, or treatment protocols, she did so with legitimate knowledge that made her deceptions virtually undetectable to someone without comparable training. Her ability to mix real medical information with harmful advice created a seamless facade of expertise and caring. The psychological impact of Rachel's campaign was perhaps more damaging than the physical effects of the medication substitution. My confidence in my own judgment eroded, as she consistently reframed my perceptions and concerns in ways that made me doubt my ability to assess my own condition accurately. When I felt that something was wrong, she provided medical explanations that made my concerns seem uninformed or paranoid. When I wanted to seek additional medical opinions, she discouraged such actions as unnecessary and potentially harmful. Rachel's manipulation of my relationship with Dr. Peterson became increasingly sophisticated during this period. She began scheduling my appointments for times when she could attend, claiming that her work schedule made certain days more convenient. During these appointments, she would speak for me when I seemed hesitant to describe symptoms, provide detailed reports of my daily activities and condition, and ask questions that demonstrated her thorough involvement in my care. Dr. Peterson clearly appreciated Rachel's dedication to my health, often commenting on how fortunate I was to have such an attentive daughter-in-law. Her professional knowledge of pharmaceuticals and medical terminology allowed her to communicate with him effectively, and her detailed observations about my condition seemed to provide valuable insights that enhanced my care. What neither Dr. Peterson nor I realized was that Rachel's reports were carefully crafted to support her narrative while concealing the true cause of my deteriorating condition. The appointments became collaborative sessions between Rachel and Dr. Peterson about my care, with me serving as the patient being discussed rather than the primary participant in decisions about my health. Rachel would describe symptoms I hadn't mentioned or hadn't noticed, suggest modifications to my treatment that she claimed to have researched, and ask questions about prognosis and care planning that seemed appropriately concerned but actually served her ulterior motives. Rachel's influence over my medical care extended beyond appointments to include communications with Dr. Peterson's office. She had positioned herself as my primary contact for scheduling, prescription refills, and follow-up care, creating a system where medical information flowed through her rather than directly to me. This gave her opportunities to filter and modify communications in ways that supported her deception while appearing to facilitate my care. The isolation tactics Rachel employed became more systematic and comprehensive, as her confidence in the success of her plan grew. She began expressing concerns about my book club friends, suggesting that their encouragement for me to remain active and independent might not be appropriate for someone with my condition. She questioned whether the weekly meetings were too stimulating or tiring, whether the evening schedule was suitable for someone taking heart medication, and whether the other members really understood the limitations I should be observing. Rachel's criticisms of my social activities were always framed as concern for my well-being, rather than attempts to control my behavior. She would cite medical articles about the importance of rest for cardiac patients, describe cases she'd heard about where overexertion had led to serious complications, and suggest that my friends might not realize how their expectations could be harmful to my health. The effect was to make my enjoyable social connections feel dangerous and irresponsible. My relationship with Margaret, my longtime neighbor, became another target of Rachel's manipulation. She began suggesting that Margaret's casual observations about my health were inappropriate and potentially harmful, creating unnecessary worry about conditions she didn't understand. Rachel implied that Margaret's concerns might reflect her own fears about aging rather than accurate assessments of my condition, and that I shouldn't allow myself to be influenced by the uninformed opinions of well-meaning but unqualified friends. The systematic undermining of my support network was accomplished so gradually and skillfully that I didn't recognize what was happening until much of the damage was already done. Each suggestion that Rachel made seemed reasonable and caring when considered individually, but the cumulative effect was to leave me increasingly dependent on her judgment and increasingly isolated from alternative sources of information and support. Rachel's manipulation of my perception of my own condition became more sophisticated as she gained confidence in her ability to control my interpretation of symptoms and experiences. When I mentioned feeling weak or tired, she would acknowledge my discomfort while attributing it to expected side effects of medication or natural progression of my condition. When I expressed worry about symptoms, she would provide reassurance that demonstrated medical knowledge while discouraging me from seeking additional medical opinions. The gaslighting techniques Rachel employed were particularly insidious because they were mixed with genuine care and real medical knowledge. She wasn't simply dismissing my concerns or telling me I was imagining things. Instead, she was providing plausible alternative explanations that made my worries seem unfounded, while preventing me from taking actions that might expose her deception. Her approach was sophisticated enough to fool not only me but also medical professionals who observed our interactions. Rachel's control over information about my condition extended to my interactions with Daniel, creating a carefully managed narrative about my health that served her purposes while maintaining her appearance as a devoted caregiver. She would call Daniel regularly to update him on my condition, describing my symptoms and limitations in ways that made him worry about my safety, while crediting her own vigilance for preventing more serious problems. These reports to Daniel served multiple purposes in Rachel's overall strategy. They positioned her as the primary source of information about my health, making Daniel dependent on her assessments rather than encouraging him to evaluate my condition independently. They also prepared him psychologically for the eventual crisis she was orchestrating, establishing a pattern of declining health that would make a serious cardiac event seem like a natural progression rather than a suspicious occurrence. Daniel's increasing worry about my condition based on Rachel's reports led him to support her suggestions about changes to my living situation and care arrangements. He began calling more frequently to check on me, but these conversations were often focused on practical concerns about my safety and independence rather than emotional connection or support. This shift in our relationship from normal family interaction to medical management felt natural given my diagnosis, but it was actually being carefully orchestrated by Rachel to serve her purposes. The financial implications of Rachel's suggestions became more explicit during this period, though they were always presented as secondary considerations to my health and safety. She began discussing the costs of potential emergency medical care, the financial burden that a serious cardiac event could place on the family, and the wisdom of making arrangements that would ensure I received appropriate care, regardless of my financial situation. Rachel's knowledge of my financial situation was more extensive than I had realized, and she used this information to craft arguments that seemed to prioritize my interests while actually serving her own. She knew about my life insurance policy, my savings accounts, and the current value of my property, allowing her to present financial scenarios that made her recommendations seem prudent and necessary rather than self-serving. The pressure to make decisions about my future care and living arrangements intensified as Rachel's reports about my condition became more alarming, and her timeline for action became more urgent. She began suggesting that waiting too long to address my deteriorating health could result in a crisis that would force hasty decisions under emergency conditions. Better to plan ahead while I was still capable of participating in decisions about my own care than to wait until choices were made for me by medical necessity. Rachel's campaign of manipulation and control had transformed my life from independent and self-directed to anxious and dependent in a matter of months. My world had shrunk to include primarily Rachel, Daniel, and medical appointments, with other relationships and activities gradually eliminated as inappropriate or dangerous for someone with my condition. My confidence in my own judgment had eroded to the point where I questioned my ability to assess my own needs and make reasonable decisions about my care. The most disturbing aspect of this transformation was how natural and inevitable it had seemed at each step. Rachel's suggestions and concerns had appeared reasonable and caring, making my gradual loss of autonomy feel like appropriate adaptation to changing health circumstances rather than manipulation by someone with ulterior motives. The skillful way she had woven legitimate medical concerns with manufactured crises made it nearly impossible to distinguish between appropriate caution and harmful control. By the end of this period, I had become almost entirely dependent on Rachel's judgment about my health, my activities, and my future plans. She had successfully positioned herself as the expert on my condition and the primary decision-maker about my care, while maintaining the appearance of being a devoted family member who was sacrificing her own time and energy to ensure my well-being. The foundation was now in place for the final phase of her plan, where the gradual deterioration she had been causing would culminate in a crisis that would seem like a natural and tragic consequence of my cardiac condition. The psychological preparation for this crisis had been as important as the physical effects of the medication substitution. Rachel had trained me to doubt my own perceptions, to rely on her medical expertise, and to accept increasing limitations on my independence as necessary adaptations to my declining health. When the inevitable emergency occurred, I would be psychologically prepared to accept her decisions about my care, and unlikely to question whether the crisis itself might have been preventable or artificially induced. Rachel's manipulation had been so comprehensive and skillful that, even as I began to suspect something was wrong, I found it difficult to imagine that someone who had demonstrated such consistent care and concern could have harmful intentions. The cognitive dissonance between my growing unease and the evidence of Rachel's devotion created a psychological trap that made it nearly impossible for me to take the actions necessary to protect myself and expose her deception. The moment that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday morning in October. I had woken up feeling particularly weak, with a strange fluttering sensation in my chest that seemed different from the usual irregular heartbeats I'd grown accustomed to experiencing. As I reached for my morning medication from the weekly organizer Rachel had prepared, one of the small white tablets slipped from my trembling fingers and rolled across the kitchen counter onto the floor. Getting down on my hands and knees to retrieve the pill was more difficult than it should have been, leaving me breathless and dizzy. As I finally grasped the tablet between my fingers, something about its texture caught my attention in a way it never had before. The surface felt smoother than I remembered, almost powdery rather than the slightly rough texture I associated with my heart medication. More importantly, when I held it closer to examine it in the morning light streaming through the kitchen window, I noticed it looked different somehow. The realization that struck me was both simple and earth-shattering. This pill didn't taste right when I placed it on my tongue. My heart medication had always had a distinctly bitter, medicinal flavor that I'd grown to associate with my morning routine. This tablet tasted sweet, almost like the breath mints I sometimes kept in my purse. The difference was so pronounced that I immediately spit it out, my heart racing with a combination of panic and sudden clarity. With shaking hands, I retrieved the remaining pills from my weekly organizer and examined them carefully under the bright kitchen light. Now that I knew what to look for, the differences were unmistakable. These tablets were slightly whiter than my actual medication, with edges that were too perfectly smooth and a surface that felt wrong against my fingertips. Most tellingly, when I crushed one between 2 spoons, it produced a fine white powder that looked and tasted exactly like confectioner's sugar. The implications of this discovery hit me like a physical blow. For months, I had been faithfully taking what I believed was life-sustaining heart medication, but instead, I had been consuming harmless sugar pills while my actual condition went untreated. The weakness, the irregular heartbeats, the declining energy levels that Rachel had attributed to medication side effects or disease progression were actually symptoms of my heart condition worsening due to lack of proper treatment. My first instinct was to call Dr. Peterson immediately, but as I reached for the phone, a more terrifying realization stopped me cold. Rachel had been the one managing my medication, picking up my prescriptions, and organizing my weekly pills for months. This wasn't a pharmacy error or an accidental mix-up. Someone had deliberately replaced my heart medication with sugar pills, and there was only one person who had both the access and the pharmaceutical knowledge to accomplish such a deception. The woman I had trusted with my life, who had positioned herself as my devoted caregiver and medical advocate, had been systematically poisoning me through medical neglect. Rachel hadn't just been manipulating my social relationships and living situation. She had been slowly killing me while maintaining the perfect facade of a loving daughter-in-law who was dedicated to my well-being. The calculated cruelty of her deception was almost impossible to comprehend. As the full scope of Rachel's betrayal became clear, I felt a surge of emotions that ranged from terror to rage to a strange, fierce determination I hadn't experienced in years. The weakness and confusion that had plagued me for months suddenly made sense, but more importantly, I realized that I wasn't dying from an inevitable progression of heart disease. I was being murdered, slowly and carefully, by someone who stood to inherit everything I owned. The evidence was circumstantial, but overwhelming, when viewed through this new lens of understanding. Rachel's convenient expertise in pharmaceutical matters, her insistence on managing my medication, her systematic isolation of me from other sources of support, and her increasingly urgent suggestions about changing my living arrangements, all formed a coherent pattern of premeditated murder, disguised as caregiving. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely hold the phone as I dialed Drive. Peterson's office. When the receptionist answered, I tried to explain that I needed an emergency appointment, that something was wrong with my medication, but my voice was breaking with emotion and physical weakness. The receptionist, who had known me for years, immediately recognized the distress in my voice and told me to come in right away, that Dr. Peterson would see me between his scheduled appointments. Getting dressed and ready to leave the house felt like an enormous challenge given my physical condition, but I was driven by the knowledge that my life literally depended on getting proper medical care immediately. As I gathered my purse and car keys, I realized I needed to bring evidence of what I'd discovered. I carefully collected several of the fake pills in a small envelope, along with the bottle they had supposedly come from, and placed them in my purse alongside the crushed remains of the tablet that had first alerted me to the deception. The drive to Dr. Peterson's office was harrowing, not just because of my weakened physical condition, but because of the paranoid fear that Rachel might somehow discover what I had learned and take action to prevent me from exposing her. Every car in my rearview mirror seemed potentially threatening. Every delay at traffic lights felt like an opportunity for her to catch up with me and stop me from reaching help. Dr. Peterson took one look at my face when I entered his office and immediately ushered me into an examination room, canceling his next appointment to give me his full attention. When I tried to explain what I had discovered about my medication, the words came out in a confused rush of accusations and fears that probably sounded like the paranoid delusions of an elderly woman whose heart condition was affecting her mental clarity. Dr. Peterson listened patiently as I described finding the sugar pills, showed him the evidence I had brought, and tried to explain my suspicions about Rachel's role in the deception. His expression grew increasingly serious as he examined the tablets I had brought, testing their texture and taste in the same way I had done that morning. When he confirmed that they were indeed sugar pills, rather than heart medication, his concern shifted from gentle patience with a confused patient to focused medical urgency. The blood tests Dr. Peterson ordered immediately showed what we both feared. My cardiac medication levels were virtually undetectable, indicating that I hadn't been receiving proper treatment for my heart condition in months. The deterioration in my heart function that had puzzled him during recent appointments now made perfect sense, as did the symptoms I had been experiencing. I was suffering from untreated congestive heart failure, made worse by the stress and anxiety of not understanding what was happening to my body. Dr. Peterson's response to this discovery was swift and comprehensive. He immediately prescribed emergency medication to stabilize my heart function and began discussing the need for possible hospitalization to monitor my condition while proper treatment was reintroduced. More importantly, for my long-term safety, he asked direct questions about who had access to my medication and who had been managing my prescriptions. When I explained Rachel's role in my medication management, Dr. Peterson's expression became grim in a way I had never seen before. As a physician with decades of experience, he had encountered medical abuse and neglect in various forms. But the deliberate substitution of life-sustaining medication with placebos represented a level of calculated harm that was both medically shocking and legally criminal. Dr. Peterson immediately documented everything I had told him, photographed the fake pills I had brought, and began the process of reporting suspected medical abuse to the appropriate authorities. He explained that what Rachel had done wasn't just a family dispute or a case of medical neglect, it was attempted murder accomplished through pharmaceutical deception, and it needed to be investigated by law enforcement as well as medical authorities. The conversation with Dr. Peterson gave me the validation and support I desperately needed, but it also made the danger of my situation more real and immediate. If Rachel discovered that I had uncovered her deception, she might escalate her timeline or take more direct action to silence me. Dr. Peterson strongly recommended that I not return home alone, and suggested that I contact someone I trusted to stay with me while we figured out how to handle this situation safely. The person I thought of immediately was Margaret, my longtime neighbor who had first noticed changes in my appearance and expressed concern about my health. Margaret had known me for 15 years, had no connection to Rachel or financial interest in my welfare, and lived close enough to provide immediate support if needed. More importantly, she was the kind of person who would believe my story and take action to help me, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about my family situation. Calling Margaret from Dr. Peterson's office felt like throwing a lifeline to someone who was drowning. When I explained that I was at the doctor's office and needed help, she immediately offered to pick me up and take me to her house, no questions asked. The relief in her voice when I accepted her offer suggested that she had been worried about me for longer than she had let on, and that my request for help confirmed suspicions she had been reluctant to voice. Margaret arrived at the medical office within 20 minutes, and the look of shock on her face when she saw my condition told me more about how much I had deteriorated than any mirror could have revealed. Dr. Peterson spoke with her privately about my situation, explaining enough about the medical emergency to help her understand the seriousness of what was happening without violating my privacy about family details I wasn't ready to share. The ride to Margaret's house was emotionally overwhelming as the full impact of what had been done to me began to sink in. I had been slowly murdered by someone I loved and trusted, someone who had systematically destroyed my health while pretending to care for my well-being. The betrayal felt almost worse than the physical danger, because it meant that every expression of concern, every helpful gesture, every moment of apparent intimacy had been calculated deception designed to facilitate my death. Margaret's house felt like a sanctuary, after months of feeling unsafe and confused in my own home. She settled me in her guest room, made sure I had everything I needed to rest comfortably, and began the process of helping me figure out what to do next. Her practical approach to the crisis was exactly what I needed. She didn't waste time on expressions of outrage or disbelief, but instead focused on immediate safety and longer-term planning. The first decision we faced was whether to contact Daniel immediately or wait until we had more information about how to handle the legal and medical aspects of the situation. Margaret's instinct was that Daniel needed to know what his wife had done, both for my safety and because he might be in danger himself if Rachel was willing to commit murder for financial gain. However, we both worried about how he would react to accusations against his wife, especially given how successfully Rachel had positioned herself as my devoted caregiver. Dr. Peterson called later that afternoon to check on my condition and discuss the results of additional tests he had ordered. The medication he had prescribed was already beginning to help stabilize my heart function, but he warned that it would take time to reverse the damage caused by months of untreated heart disease. More immediately concerning, he had been in contact with hospital security and local police about the suspected poisoning, and they wanted to interview me about what had happened. The prospect of involving law enforcement made the situation feel even more serious and frightening. I had never been involved with police in any capacity beyond routine traffic stops, and the idea of accusing my daughter-in-law of attempted murder seemed surreal, despite the evidence we had gathered. Margaret reminded me that this wasn't a family dispute that could be resolved through conversation. It was a serious crime that required professional investigation and prosecution. That evening, as I sat in Margaret's comfortable living room taking my actual heart medication for the first time in months, I began to feel stronger both physically and emotionally. The fog of confusion and weakness that had plagued me was beginning to lift, allowing me to think more clearly about what had happened and what I needed to do to protect myself going forward. The phone rang just after dinner, and Margaret answered to find Rachel on the other end, sounding frantic with worry about my whereabouts. Rachel explained that she had come by for her usual evening check-in call and found that I wasn't answering my phone or my door, and she was concerned that something might have happened to me. Her performance of the worried daughter-in-law was flawless, expressing just the right level of concern and offering to help in any way possible. Margaret handled the conversation perfectly, explaining that she had picked me up for an impromptu overnight visit because I had been feeling lonely and wanted company. She assured Rachel that I was fine and resting comfortably, and that she would make sure I got home safely the next day. Rachel's relief sounded genuine, and she asked Margaret to have me call when I felt up to it, just so she could hear my voice and know I was all right. After Margaret hung up, we looked at each other with a mixture of amazement and revulsion at how convincingly Rachel had played her role as the concerned caregiver. Her worry had sounded completely authentic, her offers of help had seemed genuine, and her relief at hearing I was safe had appeared heartfelt. The performance was so skilled that if we hadn't known about the medication substitution, we would have been touched by her dedication to my well-being. The call from Rachel also made it clear that my disappearance had been noticed, and that she would be expecting me to return home soon with an explanation for my absence. Margaret and I realized that we needed to move quickly to involve the authorities and ensure my safety before Rachel became suspicious about what I might have discovered. The window of opportunity for gathering evidence and building a case against her was closing rapidly. That night, lying in Margaret's guest room and taking real heart medication for the first time in months, I felt a combination of physical relief and emotional determination that I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. My body was already responding to proper treatment, my mind was clearing from the fog of untreated illness, and most importantly, I finally understood what had been done to me and who was responsible. The woman who had systematically destroyed my health while pretending to care for me was about to discover that she had underestimated my ability to fight back. Rachel had counted on my isolation, my dependence on her medical expertise, and my trust in her motives to prevent me from recognizing her deception. She had expected me to die quietly and gratefully, never suspecting that my death was being deliberately orchestrated by the person I trusted most. But I wasn't going to die quietly, and I wasn't going to let her get away with what she had done. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of exposing Rachel's crimes and reclaiming my life from someone who had stolen it through deception and betrayal. The breaking point had been reached, and everything was about to change. The next morning brought Detective Sarah Martinez to Margaret's front door at precisely 9 o'clock. She was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that immediately put me at ease, despite the gravity of what we were discussing. Dr. Peterson had contacted the police department's elder abuse unit the previous evening, and Detective Martinez had been assigned to investigate what she described as one of the most sophisticated cases of medical fraud she had encountered in her 15 years of law enforcement. Detective Martinez listened carefully as I recounted the entire story, from Rachel's initial helpfulness through the gradual escalation of control to my discovery of the sugar pill substitution. She took detailed notes, photographed the evidence I had saved, and asked thoughtful questions that helped me remember details I might have otherwise forgotten. Her approach was thorough but gentle, treating me as a credible witness rather than a confused elderly woman, which gave me confidence that my story would be taken seriously. The detective explained that cases like mine were often difficult to prosecute because they relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of victims whose credibility might be questioned due to age or medical condition. However, the physical evidence of the sugar pills, combined with my medical records showing the decline in my heart function and the absence of medication in my blood tests, created a strong foundation for criminal charges. More importantly, she believed there might be additional evidence that could be gathered through careful investigation. Detective Martinez's first step was to obtain a warrant to search my house and collect evidence, while Rachel was unaware that her deception had been discovered. She explained that pharmaceutical fraud cases often involved additional evidence, such as the original medications that had been removed, records of how the substitution had been accomplished, or communications that might reveal the perpetrator's motives and methods. The key was to gather this evidence before Rachel realized she was under investigation and had an opportunity to destroy it. The search warrant was executed the following day while Rachel was at work and Daniel was at his office in Portland. Detective Martinez and her team spent several hours methodically examining my house, focusing particularly on areas where Rachel might have stored the real medication she had removed or equipment she might have used to create convincing replicas of my pills. What they found exceeded even the detective's expectations for the thoroughness of Rachel's deception. In a locked box hidden in the back of my guest room closet, investigators discovered bottles of my actual heart medication with dates spanning the entire period during which I had been receiving sugar pills. Rachel had been systematically removing my real medication and replacing it with carefully crafted fakes, saving the authentic pills presumably as evidence of her careful management of my care. The meticulous record-keeping suggested a level of premeditation that transformed this from a crime of opportunity into a carefully planned murder scheme. More damning was the discovery of a small pill press and supplies for creating fake medications hidden in Rachel's car, which had been parked in my driveway during previous visits. The equipment was sophisticated enough to create pills that looked nearly identical to legitimate pharmaceuticals, explaining how she had been able to maintain the deception for so long without detection. Chemical analysis later confirmed that the fake pills were composed primarily of lactose and cornstarch, harmless substances that would dissolve in my system without providing any therapeutic benefit. The most shocking discovery came when investigators found a detailed journal hidden in Rachel's purse that documented her entire plan from conception to near completion. The journal revealed that Rachel had been planning my murder for over a year, carefully researching my medical condition, studying my medication, and developing a strategy that would allow her to kill me slowly while appearing to provide devoted care. The entries showed a chilling level of calculation and a complete absence of remorse for what she was doing. Rachel's journal entries revealed motives that went beyond simple financial gain, though the inheritance was clearly a primary factor. She had developed a deep resentment toward me that she blamed on my continued independence and what she saw as my interference in her marriage to Daniel. The journal contained bitter complaints about having to visit me regularly, angry observations about the money Daniel spent on my care, and detailed fantasies about how much better their lives would be once I was gone and they inherited my assets. Perhaps most disturbing were the journal entries that described Rachel's enjoyment of the power she wielded over my life and health. She wrote with evident satisfaction about my increasing dependence on her guidance, my isolation from other sources of support, and my gradual physical decline. The entries revealed someone who took pleasure in manipulating and controlling another person, using medical expertise as a weapon to cause suffering, while maintaining a facade of caring. The evidence gathered during the search provided Detective Martinez with everything she needed to arrest Rachel and build a strong case for attempted murder charges. However, she wanted to coordinate the arrest carefully to ensure that Daniel was protected, and that Rachel didn't have an opportunity to destroy additional evidence or flee. The detective contacted Daniel at his office to inform him of the investigation and to arrange for him to be in a safe location when Rachel was taken into custody. Daniel's reaction to the news about his wife's crimes was devastating to witness, even through Detective Martinez's careful description of their conversation. He initially refused to believe the accusations, insisting that Rachel loved me and would never do anything to harm me. When presented with the physical evidence and excerpts from Rachel's journal, he became physically ill and had to be treated by paramedics for what appeared to be a panic attack. The arrest took place at Rachel's workplace the following morning, creating a spectacle that would haunt her professional reputation, even if she were somehow acquitted of the criminal charges. Her colleagues watched in shock as she was led away in handcuffs, accused of attempting to murder her elderly mother-in-law through systematic medical fraud. The pharmaceutical company where she worked immediately suspended her pending the outcome of the criminal case, and her professional license was placed under review by the state medical board. Rachel's reaction to her arrest was telling in its complete lack of remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. According to Detective Martinez, she maintained her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence, claiming that she had been trying to help me and that my accusations were the result of confusion caused by my heart condition. She expressed anger at being arrested and seemed genuinely surprised that her activities had been discovered and interpreted as criminal rather than caring. The news of Rachel's arrest spread quickly through Riverside's close-knit community, creating a sensation that dominated local conversations for weeks. People who had known Rachel and admired her apparent devotion to my care struggled to reconcile the image of the caring daughter-in-law with the reality of someone who had been systematically poisoning me for months. The story served as a sobering reminder that evil could hide behind the most convincing facades of love and concern. My own recovery, both physical and emotional, began in earnest once Rachel was in custody, and I was receiving proper medical treatment. Dr. Peterson monitored my progress carefully as my heart function began to improve with appropriate medication, and he arranged for counseling to help me process the trauma of discovering that someone I loved had been trying to kill me. The combination of medical treatment and psychological support created a foundation for healing that had seemed impossible during the months of Rachel's deception. The legal proceedings moved forward with remarkable efficiency, given the strength of the evidence against Rachel. Her attorney attempted to negotiate a plea bargain that would have resulted in reduced charges in exchange for a guilty plea, but the prosecutor's office was determined to pursue the most serious charges possible, given the calculated nature of her crimes. The case was scheduled for trial, with expectations that Rachel could face decades in prison if convicted on all charges. Daniel's situation was particularly complicated as he struggled to cope with the realization that his wife had tried to murder his mother, while he had unknowingly supported her deception. He sought therapy to process his guilt about not recognizing the warning signs, and his grief over the loss of what he had believed was a loving marriage. His relationship with me, while strained by the circumstances, began to heal as we both worked to understand how we had been manipulated by someone we both trusted. The investigation into Rachel's background revealed a pattern of manipulation and deception that extended far beyond her treatment of me. Detective Martinez discovered that Rachel had been involved in similar schemes targeting elderly clients during her pharmaceutical sales career, using her professional access and medical knowledge to exploit vulnerable individuals. Several other cases were being reviewed to determine whether Rachel had committed additional crimes that had gone undetected. During this period of legal proceedings and personal recovery, I made the decision to reclaim control over every aspect of my life that Rachel had systematically undermined. I began by reestablishing connections with friends and activities that she had encouraged me to abandon, starting with my beloved Wednesday book club that had been such an important source of social interaction and intellectual stimulation before Rachel's campaign of isolation. Returning to the book club felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel into sunlight. My friends welcomed me back with warmth and concern, having been worried about my extended absence but respecting what they believed were my health-related limitations. When I explained what had really been happening during my months away, their shock and outrage on my behalf provided validation that helped me process my own emotions about Rachel's betrayal. I also began rebuilding my relationship with Margaret, who had become my closest ally and strongest supporter throughout the crisis. Her willingness to help me without question, to believe my story when it seemed unbelievable, and to provide practical support during the most dangerous period of my life, had literally saved me from Rachel's murderous plan. Our friendship deepened into something that felt like family, based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation or manipulation. The process of reclaiming my independence included practical steps like changing all the locks on my house, reviewing and updating my financial accounts, and ensuring that no one else had access to my medical information or prescription medications. Detective Martinez helped me understand the security measures that would protect me from similar exploitation in the future, including how to recognize warning signs of elder abuse and whom to contact if I ever felt unsafe or suspicious about someone's motives. My health continued to improve dramatically once I was receiving proper medical treatment and was free from the stress of Rachel's manipulation. Dr. Peterson was amazed by how quickly my heart function stabilized and how much my energy and overall well-being improved once the underlying condition was being properly managed. The experience reinforced his belief that many health problems attributed to aging are actually preventable or treatable when patients receive appropriate care and support. One of the most empowering aspects of my recovery was discovering new interests and capabilities that Rachel's manipulation had prevented me from exploring. I enrolled in a senior fitness program at the community center, something Rachel had discouraged as too strenuous for someone with my condition. I also began volunteering at the local library, using my professional background to help organize community programs and assist other seniors with research and technology questions. These new activities not only improved my physical and mental health, but also expanded my social network and gave me a sense of purpose that had been missing during the months of Rachel's control. I discovered that at 72 I was still capable of learning new skills, forming new friendships, and contributing meaningfully to my community. The experience taught me that aging doesn't have to mean becoming dependent or passive, despite what manipulative people might want us to believe. The trial preparation process was intensive and emotionally challenging, requiring me to relive the months of deception and manipulation in detailed testimony. However, working with the prosecutor's office also gave me a sense of agency and purpose that was crucial to my emotional recovery. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was an active participant in ensuring that Rachel faced consequences for her actions and that other potential victims were protected from similar crimes. During this period, I also began writing about my experience, initially as a form of therapy, but eventually with the goal of sharing my story to help other elderly individuals recognize and respond to elder abuse. The writing process helped me understand how Rachel's manipulation had worked and why it had been so effective, insights that could potentially protect others from similar exploitation. The therapeutic value of transforming my victimization into advocacy was immeasurable. The support I received from the Riverside community during this difficult period was overwhelming and heartwarming. Neighbors who had barely known me brought meals and offered help with errands. Local business owners expressed their outrage at what had happened and their determination to watch out for elderly community members who might be vulnerable to similar abuse. The response reinforced my faith in human goodness despite the evil I had experienced from someone I trusted. As Rachel's trial date approached, I felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about confronting her in court and testifying about what she had done to me. However, I also felt a growing sense of strength and determination that would have seemed impossible during the months when I was weak, confused, and dependent on her supposed care. The transformation from victim to survivor to advocate represented a journey of personal growth that no one could have predicted when this nightmare began. The knowledge that I had not only survived Rachel's attempt to murder me, but had also played a crucial role in exposing her crimes and preventing her from harming others, gave me a sense of accomplishment and purpose that transcended the trauma of the experience. I had discovered reserves of courage and resilience that I didn't know I possessed, and I was determined to use these newfound strengths to help others and to live the remainder of my life on my own terms, free from manipulation and fear. The courtroom fell silent as I took the witness stand 6 months after Rachel's arrest. Looking across the room at the woman who had tried to murder me, I felt no fear, only a calm determination to tell the truth about what she had done. Rachel sat beside her attorney, her face composed in an expression of wounded innocence that I now recognized as one of her many carefully crafted masks. She avoided my gaze entirely, focusing instead on her hands folded in her lap. My testimony took the better part of 2 days, during which I described every detail of Rachel's systematic deception and manipulation. The prosecutor guided me through the timeline of events, from Rachel's initial helpfulness through her gradual assumption of control over my medication and medical care. The jury listened intently as I explained how someone I had loved and trusted had slowly poisoned me while pretending to provide devoted care. The most powerful moment came when the prosecutor presented the physical evidence: the bottles of my real medication that Rachel had hoarded, the pill-making equipment found in her car, and most damning of all, excerpts from her journal detailing her plans and motivations. When the prosecutor read aloud Rachel's written descriptions of her enjoyment in watching me deteriorate, several jury members visibly recoiled in disgust. Rachel's defense attorney attempted to portray her as a caring daughter-in-law whose actions had been misunderstood, suggesting that the medication substitution had been an accident or a misguided attempt to help me manage my condition. However, the journal entries made it impossible to maintain this narrative convincingly. The evidence clearly showed premeditation, malice, and a complete absence of genuine concern for my well-being. Daniel testified for the prosecution, a decision that must have been agonizing for him but demonstrated his commitment to justice over family loyalty. His testimony about Rachel's conversations regarding my health and our family's finances provided crucial context for understanding her motives. He spoke quietly but clearly about discovering the truth of what his wife had done, and his horror at realizing how thoroughly she had deceived both of us. The verdict came after less than 6 hours of jury deliberation. Rachel was found guilty on all charges: attempted murder, elder abuse, pharmaceutical fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. As the judge read each guilty verdict, Rachel's composed facade finally cracked, and she began crying silently. For the first time since her arrest, she seemed to understand the magnitude of what she had done and the consequences she would face. At sentencing 3 weeks later, I had the opportunity to deliver a victim impact statement that I had spent weeks preparing. I spoke directly to Rachel about the betrayal I felt, not just from her attempt to kill me, but from her systematic destruction of my trust and independence. I told her that while she had tried to reduce me to a helpless victim, she had actually awakened a strength and resilience that I didn't know I possessed. The judge sentenced Rachel to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole, calling her crimes a particularly heinous betrayal of trust that strikes at the foundation of family relationships and medical care. He noted that her use of pharmaceutical expertise to commit attempted murder represented an especially dangerous form of criminal behavior that required severe punishment to protect society. Rachel's conviction made national news, highlighting the growing problem of elder abuse and the sophisticated methods that some perpetrators use to exploit vulnerable adults. The case became a teaching tool for law enforcement agencies, medical professionals, and elder care advocates, demonstrating how difficult these crimes can be to detect and how important it is for healthcare providers to remain vigilant for signs of abuse. In the aftermath of the trial, Daniel and I worked together to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. The experience had changed both of us profoundly, forcing us to examine our assumptions about family loyalty and our responsibility to protect each other from harm. While our relationship would never be the same as it was before Rachel's betrayal, it became stronger and more authentic as we learned to communicate openly about difficult topics. My recovery continued long after Rachel's conviction, encompassing not just physical healing but emotional and psychological growth that transformed my entire approach to life. I discovered that surviving such a profound betrayal had given me a different perspective on relationships, risk, and resilience. I became more selective about whom I trusted, but also more confident in my ability to recognize and respond to manipulation. The book I wrote about my experience was published 18 months after Rachel's sentencing, becoming an unexpected bestseller that reached audiences far beyond the elder care community. The book's success led to speaking engagements across the country, where I shared my story with healthcare professionals, law enforcement officers, and senior citizen groups. Each speaking opportunity reinforced my sense of purpose and helped me process my experience in a meaningful way. Margaret and I remained close friends, with our shared experience of crisis creating a bond that felt unbreakable. She often accompanied me to speaking engagements, providing both moral support and practical assistance as we traveled to share our story. Her unwavering friendship during my darkest period remained one of the most precious gifts to emerge from the entire ordeal. I also developed new friendships within the community of elder abuse survivors and advocates, connecting with other individuals who had experienced similar betrayals and found ways to transform their victimization into advocacy. These relationships provided ongoing support and inspiration, reminding me that survival was possible and that speaking out could make a difference for others facing similar dangers. My health stabilized completely under Dr. Peterson's continued care, with regular monitoring confirming that my heart function had returned to levels appropriate for my age and medical history. The physical recovery served as a daily reminder that I had not only survived Rachel's attempt to kill me, but had emerged stronger and healthier than I had been during the months of her deception. The house on Elm Street became a refuge again, rather than a place of danger and confusion. I made changes to increase both security and comfort, creating spaces that reflected my personality and interests, rather than accommodating someone else's preferences. The guest room where Rachel had hidden evidence of her crimes was converted into a library and writing space, where I worked on advocacy projects and continued writing about elder abuse prevention. Financial security was no longer a source of anxiety, as the legal proceedings had protected my assets and ensured that Rachel could never profit from her crimes. I established a foundation dedicated to elder abuse prevention and education, using a portion of my resources to fund programs that would help other seniors recognize and respond to manipulation and exploitation. The foundation's work became a central focus of my retirement years, providing structure and purpose that gave meaning to my experience of victimization and survival. We funded training programs for healthcare providers, supported research into elder abuse prevention, and provided resources for seniors who were experiencing or recovering from abuse. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying, transforming my personal trauma into social action. 3 years after Rachel's conviction, I received a letter from her in prison, the first communication between us since the trial. The letter contained what appeared to be an apology, acknowledging the harm she had caused and expressing regret for her actions. However, the letter also contained subtle attempts to minimize her responsibility and justify her behavior, suggesting that her capacity for manipulation remained unchanged despite her incarceration. I chose not to respond to Rachel's letter, recognizing that any communication with her would be potentially dangerous and unlikely to provide genuine closure or healing. Instead, I shared the letter with Detective Martinez and my therapist, using it as an opportunity to reflect on how much I had grown in my ability to recognize and resist manipulation. The letter served as a reminder that some people are fundamentally untrustworthy, and that protecting oneself sometimes requires maintaining complete boundaries. Daniel eventually remarried, choosing a partner who shared his commitment to honesty and family loyalty. His new wife, Patricia, was a retired nurse who understood the importance of medical integrity and elder care advocacy. Our relationship developed slowly but genuinely, based on mutual respect and shared values rather than obligation or convenience. As I approached my 76th birthday, I reflected on how profoundly my life had changed since that terrifying morning when I discovered the sugar pills in my medication organizer. The experience had stripped away illusions about safety and trust, but had also revealed strengths and capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. I had learned that survival was possible even after the deepest betrayal, and that healing could create opportunities for growth and service that enriched not only my own life, but the lives of others. The legacy of Rachel's crimes extended far beyond our individual story, contributing to changes in prescription monitoring systems, healthcare provider training, and elder abuse detection protocols. My advocacy work helped secure funding for new programs and influenced legislation designed to protect vulnerable adults from pharmaceutical fraud and medical exploitation. Looking forward, I felt a sense of excitement and possibility that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of Rachel's manipulation. I had plans to travel, new projects to pursue, and relationships to nurture. Most importantly, I had learned to trust myself again, to value my own judgment, and to live without fear of the people who might wish me harm. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.